Hello and welcome to The Arrives interview, where we take time to reflect on the big stories from the news and on the fortunes and affairs of the world in an hour of conversation with commentators, analysts and thought leaders. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, Times also had a love of fashion and an extraordinary sense of style, and came to be seen as one of the sharpest dressers of the 20th century. And now, nearly 30 years after he passed away, the first book ever to focus on the fashion style of the legendary Miles Davis is out, written by the author and entertainment executive Michael Stradford. Miles' Style, the fashion of Miles Davis, in a moment. So, from the mid-50s to his death in the early 90s, Miles Davis was universally recognized as one of the most innovative musicians working in jazz. GQ magazine naming Mr. Davis the best dressed musician ever, and Esquire magazine including him in its list of the 75 best dressed men of all time. And now a new book has sought to capture the fashion style of Miles Davis, and I have to say it does it brilliantly through the eyes of friends and family, and a whole host of musicians, photographers is my guest today. We'll speak to him in a moment from Los Angeles. But for more on the innovative style of Miles Davis, I'm suitably delighted to say that Michael Stradford, author of the new book Miles' Style, the fashion of Miles Davis, joins me now from Los Angeles. Really nice to see you, Michael. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us. I know it's pretty early in the morning in Los Angeles, isn't it?
It's all good, though. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Right. Well, thank you for joining us. And let's start from the very beginning, because everybody seems to have a story about how they first encountered Miles Davis. You know, a lot of it, stories that seem to stick, you know, in the mind forever. And you are, from looking at your book, no exception. I mean, just briefly tell us how you came into the world of the man they call the embodiment of cool.
Well, the first time I experienced Miles, it was, I was a child, and I got in my father's car, and there was an 8-track tape. I'm dating myself. But on the cover was this dark-skinned guy with this serious glare, and the album was called Miles Davis in a Silent Way. Popped it in the 8-track, and I didn't know what was going on. I couldn't get into it, and that was kind of it. But I always heard about Miles Davis, the Prince of Darkness, and he was this mysterious guy, but I was never really interested. And then years later, when I was in radio in Cincinnati, I did a jazz show. And there was an album, Miles Davis, My Funny Valentine Live from 1964, I think. And he had on a blue suit and a polka dot tie and a white shirt. And he just looked so elegant and so different from the initial image that I saw. I put the album on and it was acoustic. It was the exact opposite of In a Silent Way. And that music just kind of mesmerized me. And that started a very slow investigation into who this guy was.
And well, thanks for that little sort of introduction to how you first encountered Miles Davis. I noticed from scanning, I mean, I couldn't help doing this, scanning your brilliant book, that you worked at WCIN in Cincinnati, Ohio. You were talking about doing a jazz show in Cincinnati. You're actually from Cleveland, Ohio. And I went to school in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is a few, 100 miles away from Cleveland. And in the early stages of your broadcast career, you were at WCIN. I mean, you know, WCIN, of course, was a really sort of, you know, iconic radio station in Cincinnati, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. It was one of the first black formatted radio stations in the country, and it's got a lot of history. I mean, it was a great opportunity and a great place for me to start my radio career.
You obviously moved on from there. You went across the United States, became an executive at Warner Brothers and all the rest of it. But I mean, what I remember about WCIN, we'll return to Miles Davis in a minute, is the fact that I think I first heard the song Stephanie Mills, her song about, I can't quite remember the title now, but it was a really big hit in those days. And I remember when the Jacksons did their tour of the United States around that time, sort of the early 80s. I mean, I was in diapers, of course. I remember hearing about it on WCIN and, of course, buying a ticket to see that concert.
Well, we were at the same show. I know exactly the show you were talking about. That was when the Jacksons actually grew up. Michael Jackson's Off the Wall had come up, and they were touring on the Triumph album in 1981, and Stacey Lattisaw opened the show. I was there. I might have seen you.
I doubt it, but I am pretty sure I heard you on the radio, because I mean, you were obviously quite a big star in Cincinnati at the time. But moving on to your brilliant book, Miles' Style, what made you decide that it was time to write a book that would immortalize his fashion style, and that he had a fashion legacy that needed to be remembered perhaps as much as his music?
Well, I found over the years, as I got more into his music, I read more about him, and there are over 24 books on Miles Davis in print now. And all of the books always touched on his fashion, and there are beautiful pictures of him taken in the 50s, 60s, 70s by top-notch photographers like William Claxton, Jim Marshall, and many others. And he just looked amazing. And I always noticed in each of these biographies, they'd reference his style, but that was kind of it. And then when GQ and Esquire started doing their lists, and he would always come up very, very high, that just kind of piqued my curiosity. And so I started doing research for photos just to see about his different looks over different periods, and I was really surprised at what I found. So I just really started constructing the book as a hobby. A friend of mine manages the Miles Davis estate, and he was really excited about it. And he said, "Well, if you do this, we'll support it, we'll endorse it." And then Miles's nephew, Vincent Wilburn Jr., who is also one of the managers of the estate, he really got behind it, and he was very, very instrumental in a number of the interviews that I was able to get. So it just kind of came together over time. It was a labor of love. It initially started out as a coffee table book, but the cost of licensing the photos was just really prohibitive. But I felt like I had a different angle biographically, as well as some really unique, exclusive interviews discussing Miles that I thought would make the book worthwhile.
So in many ways, I mean, you could say that it is largely anecdotal, but of course the point is that, I mean, I think anecdotal ways of telling a story are actually much more interesting, aren't they?
Yeah, I felt like I wrote the book for, I guess, two types of people: those that were really familiar with Miles, and those that knew who he was but didn't know a lot about him, but were drawn in by this fashion angle. So I felt like for those that didn't really know Miles, the biographical material would give them a nice overview. And I reference other books that go deep, deep, deep into the biography. But I really like the idea of oral history. I think oral history is more personal, and people can give you more of their specific experience with someone. And I was really fortunate that the people that I interviewed were really happy to talk about Miles.
Well, I mean, we're going to talk about the people, the range of people, and what a broad range, I mean, of people that you talked to about Miles Davis and his fashion style that you included in the book. But I mean, just on a personal level, he obviously rubbed off on you musically. Did he also affect you in terms of his fashion? Did you go around sort of dressing in those sort of, at one stage, quite flamboyant bohemian styles that he had?
If I did, it was accidental, and that was prior to immersing myself in Miles. But I really appreciated his style from the 50s and 60s. I think there are photos of him from like 1953 where he's got on a beautiful brown suede jacket and some gray flannel slacks. And it's not an ascot, but he's got a scarf around his neck. And it looks, he could walk down the street wearing that today and look amazing, you know? So he didn't really affect how I dressed. I mean, there's a lot of difference. Miles was like 5'7", very dark skinned, very slim. I'm 6'5". I'm not slim. I'm bald. So stylistically, you know, the visuals would be kind of contrasting, but I definitely admired how he expressed himself through his clothes.
Okay, well, Michael, I'm going to ask you to stay with us because we're going to talk to you a lot more about Miles Davis, but do stay with us because we've got to take a break. You're watching the Arise interview, plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with the entertainment executive Michael Stradford, author of Miles' Style, The Fashion of Miles Davis. Stay. Michael Stradford, author of the new book, Miles' Style, The Fashion of Miles Davis, is still with me from Los Angeles. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. And of course, his fashion style, Miles Davis's fashion style, and the cool image that came with it had a huge influence well beyond the shores of America. I mean, in the UK, for instance, he was a style icon, and, you know, he had a big impact on the likes of, you know, the Rolling Stones and a whole host of others. I understand that Charlie Watts, who was the drummer of the Rolling Stones, started dressing exactly like him. There were also many others in the 50s and 60s, the people known as the London Mods, who were greatly influenced by a lot of the ways that sort of jazz musicians in America dressed. And of course, you know, preeminent amongst them was Miles Davis.
Yeah, Miles had an influence that reached far beyond our shores. And in addition to Europe and London, he was extremely popular in Japan. He probably found some of his largest success late in his life in Japan. They really embraced him culturally. Europe was actually one of the first times that he felt, from everything that I've read, that he felt whole. He felt like he was seen as a complete person, as a man, someone that was not suffering what he suffered as a black man in America. In France and in Europe overall, he was just accepted as a person, and that really had a significant impact on him.
And Michael, just for the benefit of those of our audience who don't know much about these things, just set the scene for us. What it must have been like for Miles Davis, enormously talented, to be living in America in the days of sort of Jim Crowism and segregation and all the rest of it.
Well, it was unique for Miles because he refused to accept the treatment that America generally put down towards black people during that time. You know, his father was a very successful dentist in the Midwest. His mother was an accomplished musician. He came from a relatively well-to-do family, and his father and mother instilled a sense of pride in himself and his ability, and told him that nobody was better than him, and that he didn't have to take a back seat to anyone. And that was ingrained in him as a very young person. So even as he faced the racism that most blacks faced, he didn't accept it, and he always fought against it.
I can imagine the effect of all of that, the psychological trauma of living during that period, but living beyond that period as well, which is probably what helped him to recover, but also the impact all that would have had, or the effect on his immune system. But let's return to your lovely, wonderful book, and I have to congratulate you. I think it's just very well written. I mean, because it's one thing to write a book, but it's also another thing for it to be artistically and, you know, accessible. I mean, very readable, very easy to enjoy, and really, you know, tells some just amazing stories about, you know, Miles Davis and the people who knew him, the people who loved him, the people who worked with him. We've got less than a minute before we have to take another break, but we will obviously come back to you and chat some more. But it really is exciting to discuss these things with you, because I mean, I myself was, if you like, a peripheral fan of Miles Davis, but with books like yours, I'm sure a lot of people like me will get to know the man better and perhaps understand the absolutely huge influence he had, not just in America, but around the world. His dress sense, I understand that in those days, in the 50s and 60s, I mean, every commercial menswear brand in the US, the UK, and even Japan were serving up a version of what the original jazz modernists like Miles Davis wore. I mean, they were making clothes to the same exacting specifications. Do you think Miles Davis was aware of how influential his fashion style had become?
I think so. I think Miles was one of the first artists to really understand the idea of brand. But he didn't do it in such a way that it diminished his priority, which was music, but he was aware that eyes were on him. So he knew that his style, he knew that his persona, it mattered, it had impact. And so I'm sure he was not surprised at what was going on. But he didn't do it. He didn't do it to get other people to do what he did. He did what he did because it felt right for him. And he wasn't really concerned about, you know, what other people did with it.
But then, of course, he had this extraordinary capacity to reinvent himself. I mean, every time he took his music in a new direction, his fashion style changed as well, didn't it?
Yeah, it seemed to. It seemed to reflect. I mean, he was just a creative being. I mean, not only in his music and in his fashion, but he was also a great cook. He loved to cook. He also, later in life, he began painting, and he was really consumed by it. So I think everything he did was just kind of an expression of his creativity, and he was not someone that liked to stand still. So the progression of his music, it would make sense that as he's trying and experimenting with different types of music.
And also a fashion icon, he was also an abstract painter. I mean, I understand his paintings made quite a lot of money.
Yeah, he sold quite a bit. There's actually a book out that has a number of his sketches and paintings, you know, oils, pencils. But yeah, his work sells for thousands and thousands of dollars, even prints and lithographs.
And I mean, I think that the most sort of marked departure, I mean, there were several sort of leaps during his life from one style to the other, but I think perhaps the most marked that I've read about, and I think you touch on in your book, is that period in the late 60s and 70s when he suddenly, you know, true to type, came up with a new sound, which inevitably meant a new fashion direction. And there's been some talk, and I'm hoping that you can verify and authenticate that for us, that he was influenced during that period by his friend Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah, well, Jimi Hendrix and Betty Davis, who was his second wife, it was a short-lived marriage, but she was generally called Madonna before Madonna. She pioneered this kind of black punk, funk, rock music, and she was beautiful. She was a model, really into high fashion. She introduced Miles to Jimmy, And she also introduced Miles to the tailors that they went to. So Miles segued from his sleek Italian suits to eelskin pants and kangaroo jackets and Nehru's. And the funny thing is, Betty Davis, who I had a chance to interview, which was really rare because she's fairly reclusive, she said that Miles looked great and all that stuff, but she really preferred seeing him in a suit. She said the first time she ever saw him, he had on just a sleek gray suit, and he was so striking that she had to know who he was, and that was how she always preferred to see him.
Well, I mean, we're going to talk just a little bit more a little bit later about the people that you interviewed in the book, and you can take us through some of them, including the likes of course, the hugely famous and enormously talented Quincy Jones. But I mean, here we are in the 60s and 70s. Miles Davis jettisons that cool modernism of the 50s in favor of a new flamboyance that was very bohemian in style, as you said. I mean, how did his fans, who are used to sort of the nice zoot suits and all of that, react to it?
Well, it was kind of tricky. You know, he was trying to branch out into a broader audience. You know, he was playing small clubs and he was seeing other artists like Hendrix and Sly and the Family Stone sell out stadiums, and he wanted a bite of that pie.
How do you mean to an extent?
Well, he didn't get the type of success that he was looking for. I mean, you know, he didn't have songs that got on the pop charts. He didn't have songs that got on the R&B charts. You know, he did not like the classification of jazz because he felt like it was limiting. He called his music social music because that's what he thought it was. So while he expanded, I think, his awareness to other audiences, namely younger white rock-oriented audiences, it didn't really translate into the type of massive sales that he hoped that it would. But it ultimately helped enhance his iconic image, his iconic persona, whereby when he came back,
the albums Bitches Brew and In a Silent Way are sort of emblematic of that era, aren't they? I mean, his signature look became loose Indian shirts, from what I read, and sort of dashikis and things like that. I mean, was there something also political in his decision to dress that way?
I don't think it was consciously or overtly political. He just liked what he liked. Yeah, I don't think politics really entered into it. I think as time went on and he moved into a different realm of music, I think he realized that suits and ties didn't
70s, early 70s. I mean, you know, you had Martin Luther King, the mid 60s civil rights marches, not just in America, but also in Europe, in England. You know, you had a lot of the marches as well, with the Rivers of Blood speech and so on and so forth. I mean, what did he play any role at all in that very sort of, you know, notable political era in America's history?
He wasn't overtly political, but he was very clear in how he felt Black people were treated in America and how they should be treated. And he knew that the way he presented himself and what he was able to achieve was inspiring to Black people, and that was important to him. But there's a famous interview that he did. Actually, it was the first interview that Playboy magazine ever did, and Alex Haley conducted it with Miles Davis, and I think it was 1962, where he gets very specific about the condition of Black people and how Black people are treated in America, and how he wanted to see Black people and other people of color be acknowledged and recognized and respected as complete human beings. So he was always about that. He wasn't especially politically active, but he was very vocal about how he felt about the conditions of the times and what Black people should and should not accept.
And of course, just briefly, because we've got to go on a break in a minute, beyond wanting better treatment for black people, including himself in America, he also craved recognition. I mean, from the white society, did he or didn't he?
I don't know that I think he wanted to be recognized for his talent, but I think he also was confident enough to know that even if they didn't want to give him the recognition, the talent was still the talent. But he really didn't have to suffer that because he was acknowledged pretty early as one of the most talented musicians out there.
And Michael Stradford, author of the new book, Miles' Style, The Fashion of Miles Davis, is still with me from Los Angeles. Thank you for hanging in there with us, old chap.
My pleasure.
Let's talk some more about the people in your book. And I think what makes it really interesting is the range of characters you interviewed about the style of Miles Davis. Tell us about some of them.
Well, that was, to me, the best part of the book. Was everyone that I talked to was eager to talk to Miles, and everyone had amazing stories. I guess to start with, I worked for Quincy Jones for about 4 years with Quest Records when he had his record company. So when I reached out to him, it was supposed to be a 20-minute chat, and I wound up being there for about 3.5 hours. Quincy loved Miles, and he had plenty of stories to share. And it's really interesting to me. Miles has been gone more than 20 years, and people still get teary talking about him. And I think what was most surprising is people generally think of Miles as this dark, mysterious guy, which he was to an extent. But a lot of people have a lot of deep love for him. And I got that every time I talk to anybody. From Michael Henderson, the bass player, to Marcus Miller, the bass player, to Ron Carter, the bass player, to his wife, Frances Davis, to Betty Davis, his second wife. Brian Ferry was kind enough to do a quick email interview with me because he had always seen Miles Davis as one of his biggest influences, both sartorially as well as musically. It was just a great, great experience. And to talk to a couple of the people that made clothes for him, like Charlie Davidson, was really enriching. So that was, for me, the best part of the book. And that was why I really felt compelled to make part of the book these oral histories, because I feel like the participants were so enthused and they were so compelling that I wanted to put it out there as unvarnished as I could.
Well, no, absolutely. I think that was a good idea. As I said, it makes the book very accessible and very readable and very interesting. But I mean, you know, it must have been quite a challenge trying to get all these people together. How long did it take you to, you know, interview them, put the book together, and then release it?
Well, it took several years. I mean, the project was off and on for several years because, you know, in addition to that project, I had my job and I also got married, and, you know, life was just life. So it took a while, but I just kept going until, you know, I felt like I had enough to tell the story. Generally, the most difficult thing was just schedules. You know, everyone that I interviewed was on board quickly to participate, but it was just a matter of working the schedules out. So I tried to make myself as flexible as possible, and we were able to get some really good stuff.
Well, let's get some of the important things out of the way here. How can we get a hold of your book if we want to purchase it?
There are a couple ways. You can go to my e-commerce site, which is milesstylebooks.com. And I'll send a signed autographed copy. You can also get it from Amazon.com or Amazon.co.uk. I can't sign those. So if you're interested in an autographed copy, it's milesstylebooks.com.
And I assume I assume there's an online version because I mean, people like me, lots of people these days read things on Kindle.
Yes, there is an ebook version available via Amazon.
Right, and let's just talk a little bit more. I thought, we should get the important part out of the way, which is, of course, gaining possession of the book. Not just in terms of selling it, but I mean, the fact that it is it's a piece of extraordinary history there. But I mean, Miles Davis, as you said, and as your book, talks about so eloquently, blazed a fashion trail. He also found many other additional creative outlets, but I suppose the one that obviously you've noted is the fashion one. I mean, did he ever consider designing and marketing his own clothes line?
Not that I'm aware of, and it doesn't sound like that would be a part of his MO, because Miles was generally about creative expression. He wasn't necessarily about marketing and merchandising to that extent. I think that it would be more of a hassle to him than it would have been worth.
And obviously, you've spent quite a lot of time putting this book together. What do you think his sartorial style and evolution said about the man himself, having spent these years going through it as you did?
I think that it tracks back to him as a young person, just being encouraged to be open to impulses that spoke to him.